everything in the world, everything in life is about sex, except for sex, which is about power. The numbers are staggering. Famous people, Jimmy Savile, Huw Edwards obviously is one. There were 41 images, and 7 of which are called Category A. It's highly unlikely that person who is that sophisticated is doing that kind of manipulation for the first time. In coming after you, they are killing the cash cow that makes the BBC what it is, what makes it a successful organisation. So the more interesting theory, I think, psychologically, is
an inordinate number of celebrities have started to have children who are apparently trans.
Simply saying that I feel I was born into the wrong body isn't good enough. We should always be thinking about whose interests are being served. What are people trying to get us to believe?
Tell me, what is just a little bit about your background? What are you?
So I'm a psychiatrist. You may be aware that a psychiatrist is someone who's been to medical school and therefore is a qualified doctor and therefore can prescribe medication. So people with delusions, people who believe they're God, I've treated those people, and people who hear voices, that kind of stuff. So I worked in the NHS as a consultant psychiatrist, which is the top spot, as it were, in a hospital in the NHS for many years. But then I moved into private practice because it became very stressful. It became very dangerous. There are not enough beds for seriously mentally ill people. And as a result, the management at the hospitals I worked at kept making me discharge people who were not well enough to be discharged, who were actually dangerous. And I couldn't cope with that anymore. So I left and I now work purely in private practice. And I've been working in private practice in Harley Street for about 10 to 15 years. But the other thing I did do was I have done a lot of broadcasting on TV and radio, and I've written many newspaper articles. And it kind of all began with a famous MP, Stephen Milligan, I think his name was, who was found in tragic circumstances having died, taking part in the fetishistic sexual practice of autoerotic asphyxia.
Right.
Normally, when I give a talk about this sort of thing, and I mention autoerotic asphyxia, the women in the audience look at me blankly, and the men just giggle nervously. So this is a sexual act where people strangle themselves.
I didn't know we were going to be here within 1 minute of the interview, but go on. I mean, the Robin Williams film, before he died, there was a film where his son had done that.
Okay, right. So basically, a famous MP died in these circumstances, and the press couldn't understand what this whole thing was. So the press office at the psychiatric hospital I worked at, the Maudsley, got bombarded with calls. The press office rang me, and I wrote an article in the Daily Mail explaining what autoerotic asphyxia was. And then Richard and Judy, who ran a famous daytime TV show, read my article in the Daily Mail the next day and thought to themselves, in typical daytime TV fashion, why don't we do a phone-in on fetishes and perversions at 10:30 in the morning? So I got invited onto the show, and the rest, as they say, is history. I became the agony uncle on This Morning and on Cosmopolitan magazine, and I've done a lot of broadcasting and writing for the popular media. But basically, I do have a proper day job, which is I am an actual doctor, hard to believe, and I see patients and I work as a psychiatrist.
And also have done with, I know you can't name individuals, but with some stars.
Well, partly because I met a lot of very famous people in the green rooms of various TV studios and radio studios and so on. I have ended up, for various reasons, seeing a lot of very famous people. That is true. Obviously, I can't divulge who they are, but a lot of the situations, and we're going to discuss a particular situation where a very famous person comes into the media spotlight because of very adverse allegations. I'm used to dealing with the reality of that behind the scenes. When people are in the spotlight and are in trouble, often I've dealt with that. So I have a lot of experience. So I get asked a bit, like you're asking me, a bit about what the reality is for someone in that kind of media maelstrom. So I've actually dealt with it directly.
Okay, so and that's why we're going to talk today about it's Huw Edwards I want to talk about, who those outside the UK might not know is a BBC news presenter. He was the guy at the top. Is there in your mind a pattern? Is there a type of celebrity who gets to the top who not necessarily has what Huw Edwards has for children or whatever, but is somebody who might commit crimes and think they can get away with it?
Well, so there's a famous quote, and it's meant to come from Oscar Wilde, though it's controversial. And the quote goes something like this: everything in the world, everything in life is about sex, except for sex, which is about power.
Wow. I like
Now, you can see straight away why fame might get tangled up with that sort of area of sex, because fame is about power. Famous people have power. And over again, we've seen a pattern, and psychiatrists and psychologists are interested in patterns, where famous people, Jimmy Savile, Huw Edwards obviously is one, Jonathan King, and many other names, Rolf Harris.
Schofield.
Yes, have got into trouble in the sexual arena, often doing inappropriate things. So one of the questions is there a link between celebrity and fame and a proclivity for this kind of area? So most people think about it as the fact that famous people have power and they may exploit that power, and that's why they end up in trouble. To do with the sexual arena. A couple of things I have to say. The statistics on sexual abuse of children are frightening in terms of how common it is. Surveys of women suggest up to 40% of women as children experienced some kind of sexual encounter, inappropriate sexual encounter. So the numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously a lot of people who are perpetrators are not celebrities, but what the point I'm trying to make is, given it's very, very common, it wouldn't be a complete surprise that you would find it as a problem amongst famous people or famous men. And in the Huw Edwards case, it is very interesting how the case begins, which is that a homeless person makes contact with him and says, I need some money. And this is the story that broke in the Sun a while before the actual criminal investigation over the possession of illegal images. And this homeless person was given money by Huw Edwards. Okay. Now, this homeless person contacted Huw Edwards because it was Huw Edwards, right? And then Huw Edwards gave him money. It's very interesting in terms of the manipulation that's often at the heart of this kind of sexual encounter. And only later on, after giving more and more sums of money, the Sun alleges it's £35,000 in total, did he ask for favours in return. Right. That's very interesting because that's quite sophisticated manipulation. A less sophisticated manipulator would say when someone asks for money, I'll give you the money, but I want this in return up front, right? This person led this person down a certain line by giving them money, not asking for anything at the beginning, and after having established a dependency, perhaps, began to exploit it. So to a psychiatrist, and one of the things we're going to discuss is whether the BBC and the police, when they investigated that story, because they kind of decided no criminal activity had occurred. The boy was 17 at the time, I think. Mm-hmm. But were there some red flags? I mean, that level of manipulative behavior, I would suggest to a psychiatrist, is a red flag, because it's highly unlikely that person who is that sophisticated is doing that kind of manipulation for the first time.
Oh, interesting.
And also, when you come to sex is also compulsive. It's always compulsive. So again, when you get a sexual event, it's very rarely it's a one-off. It's usually likely that a person has a history of doing this. So the more interesting theory, I think, psychologically, is, do some men in particular pursue fame, sorry to put it bluntly, in order to get laid? In other words, we think they're pursuing fame because of all the accoutrements of fame that come with it, like the money and so on and so forth, or the Ferraris, etc., etc. But actually, are they a group of men, because their sexual predator behavior seems to go on for such a long time, who actually are doing it the other way around? They're sexual predators, and they notice that becoming famous gives you access for all sorts of reasons, and that's the reason why they're driven. It's the other way around. Than you become famous, notice that women throw themselves at you, or you have power, and then you decide to exploit it.
Wow.
One other point I want to make is I've noticed this amongst famous people, which is that they are, to some extent, what you might call adrenaline junkies. You think about presenting the news, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news every night. Millions of people are watching you. It's a very intense experience, right? You've got to get word perfect. And then when the lights go out, there's a bit of a downward spiral in terms of the letdown, a bit like some people would say the letdown of having taken an intense drug like cocaine. Okay. And I think that from what my clinical experience, some famous people get a bit addicted to intense experiences, and they have intense experience after intense experience in the TV studio, and it begins to get a bit boring. Okay. And they then begin to look for intense experiences elsewhere, and breaking the law, doing something wicked, particularly in the sexual arena, is an intense experience as well. Wow. So that's one of the reasons why I think they tend sometimes, not always, to drift into that arena.
You're quite insightful, Dr. Raj.
That's very kind of you to say that.
Do people call
Do
you
you say that to all your psychiatrists?
Do they call you Dr. Raj or Dr. Persaud?
They call me Raj. Call me Raj.
Interesting. I like that. Some people insist I add doctor when some of my
Really?
psychiatrists, I can't remember who it was. Somebody said, I prefer doctor, thank you.
Really?
I can't remember who that
Blimey.
was now as a
Okay.
guest. Yeah. That's really interesting. And you know what? Because I don't get nervous doing these because it's all recorded, it's in my studio, whatever. But when I go on live TV, say on GB News, I do get very nervous beforehand. I get in a bit of a stress, and then there's a live audience and all of those things. And I'm stressed all day about it. And then afterwards, I'm driving home and it's just like quiet and nothing. And I definitely know what you're talking about of like oh, nothing's happening now. And I was just in this big moment. I was too nervous to even enjoy it. And now there's just this nothing. And if I were somebody inclined to, sexual proclivities and all of those things, I can see how that push me in that direction. Fortunately, I'm a very clean and sober man. Before we get onto the crimes, I guess you've already spoken about some of the crimes, but the crimes he's recently admitted to, of course, his on-screen persona, apparently he was pretty abusive to people. Do we know a bit about that?
Well, immediately after the allegations were published in The Sun, several young staff members who worked at the BBC immediately came forward, it is said, and complained to the management that they had been approached by this famous newscaster. And again, part of the allegation about the neglect of the BBC is they didn't properly investigate that. While we're on that subject, one of the other reasons why people like Jimmy Savile look like, because again, Jimmy Savile's crimes were only revealed after he died, right? And up until the funeral and everything for a period of time afterwards, he was still kind of lauded by the whole of society. So what happened only came out afterwards. What the investigations found was that being famous has a power as well, because in Jimmy Savile's case, he raised so much money for various NHS hospitals. A lot of the sexual abuse, it turned out later, occurred in NHS hospitals, which is horrendous. But one of the things that was happening was these NHS hospitals, three main ones are implicated, of which Stoke Mandeville is one of them, were the theory is were so addicted to his money raising that they didn't want to rock the boat, and therefore they tended to turn a blind eye. So part of the power of fame, and one of the theories now about Jimmy Savile, going back to manipulativeness, is that he pursued the charity fundraising. He's meant to have raised over £40 million in his lifetime, and that's worth a lot more now in today's money, was actually a cover. It was a cover for it allowed him to perform the abuse and get away with it, because people were scared to get rid of or rock the boat in terms of this cash cow, of this kind of charity fundraising that was coming in. So the other deep manipulation that is going on is that not only does fame give you access, it also insulates you from possible criticism or people coming after you, because people are scared. If you're the main newscaster at the BBC, if you're the one that covered the Queen's funeral, to what extent are your management going to come after you? Because in coming after you, they are killing the cash cow that makes the BBC what it is, what makes it a successful organization. To some extent, therefore, are some stars, a bit like, to use a banking analogy with the financial crisis, too big to fail? So are they so big that the organizations are scared of messing with it? Because in a way it becomes like almost a suicidal act for the organization. And are these famous people aware of that? And are they exploiting that to some extent?
What does it say to you about human nature? And I mean this in quite a nihilistic sense, that individuals time after time are willing to ignore such heinous accusations because of their own egotism or their own desires, and because they want their channel to do well?
Well, it's a deep problem in human nature that whistleblowers in any kind of situation, not just in the situation of sex crimes, but we see this in NHS, find themselves alone. And there's a famous saying in psychology about terrible crimes throughout human history, like the Holocaust and so on, that the actual criminals that do the thing are a small group of people. It's the bystanders, in a way, that are the real problem. Because if people stop being bystanders and always, when they saw bullying in the workplace or something wrong, stood up to it, then, crimes of that kind might well disappear, because there are many more bystanders than there are criminals. So there's something deep in our psychology that stops us being bystanders, and that is about conforming. That the whistleblower has made a decision to step outside what it is to conform and are willing to take the risk of being a non-conformist. And there's a very deep part of human psychology which doesn't want to do that. At the risk of challenging you're doing a thing, podcasting, which is definitely not a conformist thing to do. You're willing, I suspect, to be quite assertive and to be a bit difficult from time to time. I'm going out on a limb here in terms of guessing your psychology.
In other words, you've known me for some time, though, so I think you've painted a picture.
So I believe that if you saw something bad going on, I think you would speak up. Not because I'm necessarily saying you're a particularly moral person, but I think you are someone who's willing to not care what people think, and that's the crucial thing. There's a certain bloody-mindedness that's required in individuals to stop being bystanders and to stand up to something, and that's a very rare quality. We all want to tend to conform, and also we believe if no one else is saying anything about it, maybe I'm in the wrong and maybe it's okay. I think you're the kind of individual that would say, if everyone else is saying it's okay, maybe it's not okay. You'd go the other route, I think. But what do you think? Am I right about you?
That's very interesting. I wonder to what extent, I mean, I'd like to think I've always been somebody who a bit of a contrarian, with teachers.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
With a rabbi when I was a kid, I was always like, shut up. But while trying to be respectful as well. I'm sure you're of my ilk as well, by the way.
So we're difficult people, and as a result, organizations don't like us. I think both of us found ourselves in the end working independently of organizations, I think. And I think that's no accident. And I think the kind of person who's willing to cause trouble, not just for the sake of causing trouble, but in pursuing something, like one of the reasons I couldn't stay in the NHS was I was a troublemaker. I wouldn't go along with some of the things that I saw were dangerous. I think, oddly enough, organizations don't realize something. The troublemaker, if they're making trouble for the right reason, are the people who are most genuinely committed to the actual thing the organization's meant to be doing. And I think organizations could go down a route like the NHS has done. I believe you're going to see a lot of scandals will be exposed in the future in terms of the brutality and cruelty in the NHS because it's lost track of what it's meant to be about. And I think the troublesome individuals who fight the corner and become whistleblowers, who are often targeted by organizations and moved out, are the golden people you want to hang on to. But I think organizations don't see it that way. And that feeds back to the Huw Edwards thing. There's too much a thing that people don't cover enough. They focus on the villain, they don't focus on the bystanders, and they don't focus on the conformity that leads people to just turn a blind eye. I think you're raising a very important point.
Is that final Seinfeld episode? Have you seen that?
No, I don't think so.
Have you watched Seinfeld? Seinfeld's final ever episode has them all. It's not a spoiler because it was about 25 years ago. So if you've not got to this point, but it has the four characters watching somebody get mugged, and they just film it, and they just go like, "Oh, look at that," because they were the sort of the anti-sitcom because they didn't want to be like Friends and all the other ones where at the end everybody's all cuddly. They were just horrible, and they get arrested because the state they were in had some sort of bystander law. And because they hadn't said anything, they went to prison.
Yeah,
it was all quite funny.
Yeah, but it's really a very important issue. How many of us, for starters, because we're all going to be bystanders because we're scared of speaking up, we don't even look carefully at what's going on because it can be dangerous to look too carefully. And again, troublemakers like you and me always ask questions at meetings like, why are we doing it this way?
Do you think there's a cause and correlation thing here where often somebody will find themselves accidentally maybe cancelled or kicked out and they didn't realize it would happen to them? And once that's happened, they're no longer being love bombed by their own mainstream crowd. They're on the outside and they're more encouraged to share the ideas and to repeat the ideas of those on their outside group.
Yes, but I also think it comes back to this thing of what people are fundamentally driven by, and we're very driven by the need to be popular, and they're driven by the need to be loved and liked by those around us. And it is dangerous. It goes back to ancient evolutionary history when we survived in tribes. To be unpopular in a tribe was really dangerous because if you got kicked out from the tribe and you were now alone on the African prairie, you were, very vulnerable to being eaten by predators or the other enemy tribes. So we've got a very strong, almost genetic need to be part of the tribe, be part of a tribe of some description. So I think that feeds back in a roundabout way to the Huw Edwards thing, which is that people focus on the individual criminal. Actually, I mean, the famous thing that was said about Jimmy Savile, hiding in plain sight. It was now, on reflection, obvious some of the stuff that was going on, but people were blind to it. And at the heart of psychiatry is that interesting dilemma. Usually when I see patients, what they need to do is obvious. They're blind to it. Why are they so blind to the obvious? Because often very strong emotions involved in making them blind. I see many people who come in and say, I'm worried that my partner's having an affair. And it's blindingly obvious when they start telling me the story. The partner's obviously having an affair, and like everyone around them probably knows it. The only person who doesn't know it is the individual asking the question. And the reason they're blind to it is they are motivated not to see it, because if their partner really is having an affair, they maybe should get a divorce, and they don't want a divorce.
It's going to be a difficult decision.
Yeah, or pain will come your way. So again, bad things are happening in the office. People are blind to it, even though it's right in front of them, because it will lead to difficulty, and they want to avoid difficulty.
Their body is warning them not to look too far into this, because if you do, you're going to be on the outside and you're going to be eaten by animals.
Yes. Well, there's a very strong evolutionary psychology idea that we are very strongly driven to conform. And if we don't conform, it could be dangerous for us.
I love being with non-conformists. I love it. I get frustrated by a lot of the woke stuff today. We'll get onto a bit of that later to try and get you in trouble. But I get frustrated by the thing that annoys me more than any part of it is a feeling within those circles that they're being rebellious, when really it's very obvious to anyone outside of it. They're just parroting a very mainstream thing that you could say on all the corporations are saying the same thing. You know, Adidas or Nike would say exactly what they're saying, and they're supposed to be on the left and rebelling against this. They're just repeating the same stuff that, the TV channels. But anyway.
But that's a deep need. Let's go back to ordinary human conversation. Observe any ordinary human conversation, and there's a drive to try and reach agreement. Terrible weather we've been having recently. Yes, I agree. Okay. Very rarely do you hear people just perpetually saying, no, I don't agree. There's a drive to find common ground, and there's a drive to find an agreement, which I understand that human need. The question is, does that sometimes get in the way of seeing the truth? And we believe that argument, and I suspect you and I will have an argument at some point, is often the way, an intelligent argument, to get at the truth. And I think that is something that people need to see more of. Instead, they want to surround themselves with people that reinforce their own prejudices. People buy a newspaper that reinforces their prejudices. Is that really a way at getting at the truth? The best way is to challenge your ideas. And in fact, that's at the heart of what therapy is. Therapy is about an idea, which is you're going to have ideas about why you're depressed, but I'm going to challenge them. And we're going to have a challenging conversation, but hopefully one where you don't feel so threatened that you don't see that challenging your ideas is actually one of the healthiest things that you can do in terms of getting at the truth, and also not landing yourself in trouble.
That's interesting. With Huw Edwards, with regards to... Okay, so firstly, he made himself powerful. When I refer to him being abusive, is that I've read that not only was he coming on to other young people there, but that he was gruff and mean and not very nice. And you get a sense of that on TV. His persona, I don't know how someone like that gets to the top. He's not very likable. He was always miserable and dour. I know he had his own mental health issues, doesn't he? I believe, and I don't mean to make light of the fact he may have been depressed, but that dour look, what is it that got him to where he was?
Well, that's a very interesting question. They said the same thing about Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was an obviously very odd guy and very eccentric. How come he came to dominate TV screens? I mean, when Top of the Pops closed for the final episode, he was the final guy on, sort of switching off the studio lights. So he was, and he got a knighthood. And yet now we reflect, he just was kind of creepy, obviously creepy, right? Again, so how is it, going back to the point we were making earlier, the lens, the way people look at things is hugely influenced by the way they think about the world, and they're not willing to see through their blindness into what really is right in front of them quite often.
It's, angry, mean person, he seemed like. Well, he got to where he was. Do you imagine that there is, I know we spoke about this at the beginning, that there might be more prevalence of that P word, I'm not supposed to say on YouTube, but people with an inclination for children in maybe the BBC or in TV channels, because it just seems quite prevalent.
Well, remember, I did say it was actually very prevalent out there in ordinary society, so it's important that we see that. I did say that one of the theories about why you're going to find a lot of it amongst famous people is that maybe fame, particularly for men, being famous as a guy is a bit like being, Megan Fox or Marilyn Monroe if you're a woman, basically.
Is that how you found it so far?
Well, I've been married for 30 years, so unfortunately, or fortunately, I became famous after I got married.
I know.
I wish it had happened before, but it is what it is.
I've been making the same mistake. Those lucky wives of ours.
Anyway,
yes.
So basically, one theory is that people are pursuing fame because, for men in particular, the male-female dynamic, I'm going to get into trouble, but don't shoot the messenger. I'm just reporting what the research finds, which is that men tend to, there's a famous saying, men search or men chase and women choose. So there is a dynamic whereby men are used to being rebuffed quite a lot. And what happens if you're a famous man is that you don't get rebuffed in quite the same way. So it's like almost a key to a lock, which many men are trying to find a way of unlocking this door. And fame supplies an amazing key for many men. And this is my clinical experience of dealing with famous men. So one of the questions is, do they realize that at some level? And that's why they're after becoming famous, because a lot of famous men do exploit it. Another thing I have to say about being famous, from my clinical experience of dealing with famous men in particular, it's almost like they think, given I've done all this work, because usually a lot of work and sacrifice goes on behind the scenes to become famous, and we don't see that work. There's a sense of dissatisfaction. Yes, I can get maybe an occasional table in a restaurant that's difficult to get, but it doesn't often deliver for them what they hoped it would deliver. You still have, and this is a common problem in life, the difficult mother-in-law, whether you're famous or not famous. A lot of things actually don't change in life that are a real pain in the ass. So I think that sometimes they kind of go around going, I ought to be able to have more for the fame. And that's why they become transgressive, because it takes them into territory where they discover things get delivered to them because of their fame. And in other words, I think a lot of famous people are a bit frustrated that fame hasn't panned out as they hoped it would be in terms of delivering happiness. And now they use the fame in a transgressive way because they discover it gives them power. And actually, being a famous person and staying within the rules doesn't give you that much power. So I think it's that pursuit of power that leads them into transgression, I think.
So you spoke of adrenaline junkies, you're speaking of power, you're speaking of celebrity and lording it over people and all those kinds of things, ambition. Are these characteristics of psychopathy or on the spectrum towards that way?
Okay. Now we're discussing a very interesting thing, which is personality theory about people who break the rules and end up in trouble. And this word psychopath is used a lot. I'm not trying to tell you off when I say that, but it's often used incorrectly. And I'm going to get into a slightly technical conversation because there's two other personality types that need to be understood when we're discussing this. And the great thing about these three personality types is known as the dark triad, which I think is a cracking term. So the first one in the dark triad is psychopathy. We'll discuss what that is in a minute. Then there's narcissism, and then there's Machiavellianism. And the point is that you need to hold all three to really cause serious trouble. Usually, if you just have one, that's not enough. So generally speaking, the people you find that hit the news or blow up a company because of their transgressive behavior have elements of three of the dark triad. So psychopathy is relevant to what we're talking about because psychopaths don't have empathy. So they can abuse a child, let's say, or manipulate a homeless person by giving them money and then exploiting them sexually. And there's something missing within them, and we think partly it may be even genetic or something to do with their upbringing, whereby they don't understand what might it be like for the other person. They don't understand the suffering or the distress. Not only do they not even see it, but they don't really care. So what if the other person's suffering? So there's a kind of emotional coldness there, which is crucial to being a villain and not really thinking through very carefully. But other elements of psychopathy that are relevant, that often you don't see in Hollywood movies, but are relevant, is impulsiveness. They're very impulsive. So as a result, they tend to, they see something and then they go for it. While the rest of us are thinking a bit more cautiously, is this wise? The other thing is they're willing to do anything to get to the top. So these people stab you in the back and they don't care. And the other really interesting thing about psychopaths, and this is a little known research fact outside of the academic arena, is when you survey psychopaths and ask them how much do they think psychopathy is out there in the world, right? They always vastly overestimate it. So they think everyone else is a psychopath, right? So they think it's okay for me to be a psychopath because it's like kill or be killed, shaft or be shafted. Most other people who aren't psychopaths tend to assume benignness out there in the world. And by the way, that can be dangerous if you assume too much benignness and don't realize a certain number of people out there who are roaming the streets are psychopaths. So that's psychopathy. Then there's narcissism. Narcissism is you believe you're a wonderful, beautiful human being and you're so outrageously amazing at what you do that how come you're not more successful? So there's this thing that then leads into what's called the narcissistic rage, where people are upset that despite their marvelousness, and even people who present the 10 o'clock news, if they're genuine narcissists, are thinking, why have I not got 5 BAFTAs? Why have they only given me 3 BAFTAs? Why am I not getting an Oscar, etc., etc.?
Yeah.
So
I know a few people like that.
So they are driven to always be dissatisfied and a bit upset and a bit angry, no matter how much accolades they're getting. Now, there is a sense in which a little bit of narcissism makes people interesting. There's a famous saying in psychology that narcissists are great on a first date. There's something about their self-confidence that's quite endearing, but it wears very thin by the 10th date, their self-obsession and self-obsessiveness. So there's narcissism. And finally, there's Machiavellianism, which is the bit that people know least about, but is actually perhaps the most important thing. Going back to the Huw Edwards thing, a homeless person contacts them, according to The Sun, and asks for money. He gives them money, but he doesn't ask for anything in return. Gives them more money, gives them more money, gives them more money, and then begins to say things like, aren't you going to do anything for me? Okay? That's the tone of what The Sun said was the nature of the interaction. So Machiavellianism is named after Machiavelli, a Florentine prince from 1500 in Florence, Italy, wrote a famous book called The Prince. The Prince is a guide to power. What's important about Machiavelli is he places power as being the key human dynamic between people. We like to think that between people there's friendship, there's love, there's romance, there's these sentimental stuff. Machiavelli's going, no. You need to understand something. There's always a power dynamic. There's a jockeying for position. And the famous quote, which Machiavelli may not have said, is people are a means to an end. A Machiavellian, when they meet you, are praising you and saying, oh, you play a really good game of tennis, Raj. There's a hidden agenda. They're praising you.
There must be if they're praising your tennis.
Thanks. So they're always after something, and they're softening you up, and you're malleable. So the manipulativeness, which is another word for Machiavellianism, is a key dynamic. And so you need all 3, the dark triad, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopath. People tend to think you only need 1, but really, to blow things up in a major way, all 3 are essential. One final point about Machiavellianism, because it's a neglected subject, and I think it's actually, in a sense, much more important than psychopathy and narcissism, because the key thing is, once you can spot a narcissist as a narcissist, or a psychopath as a psychopath, you can protect yourself from them. You need the manipulativeness bit, right? Because manipulative people charm you so you don't see the psychopathy or the narcissism. And that's when people get dangerous. When you don't see, once you've met a psychopath, if you can spot they're a psychopath, they can't be that dangerous to you because you start protecting yourself. They say, lend me some money. You go, no. But a manipulative person charms you. You don't see the dark side. And as a result, that's why that's much more dangerous. So one final point I want to make about Machiavellianism, because it has been very interestingly studied by psychologists in a way that the lay public don't understand. There's some great scales in psychology that can measure how manipulative you are. They can actually scale you and give you a score. And it's called the Mac scale. And I love the fact that you can be high Mac, which is very manipulative, or low Mac, or if you overeat, Big Mac. Sorry, it's an old joke, but I had to make it sooner or later.
God. Can we do it on me? I want to do this test. Am I manipulative?
I don't know. So far, I've found you fairly straightforward. But
that's because I'm so good at it.
That's exactly.
Okay, so but I'm definitely
really
narcissistic.
Manipulative people, you can't spot it. That's the key point.
I must be narcissistic because my first thought is, I wonder if I'm the thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's always about you.
It's always about me. No, it's about the guests. It's about the guests. Okay, so it's interesting that he might be this Machiavellian kind of figure, Huw Edwards, and several others who have gotten to the top. There's been so many stories. I mean, of course, in America, Harvey Weinstein. Of course,
they have to have a strong element of Machiavellianism to have made it, to have the dark side and to cover it up so well so that people don't see it. That's the point I'm trying to make.
There was a fellow who interviewed Tom Cruise as well in the States. I forgot his name right now. Oh, what was his name? And he got in loads of trouble as well. Bollocks. Hang on, I'm looking this up. Psychology, Tom Cruise, Matt Lauer, he got in all sorts of trouble, similar kinds of thing that he was getting up to. The reason I mentioned psychopath with regards to Huw Edwards is he obviously was taking some big risks. I mean, it ended up, that was one kid you were talking about, or 17-year-old. Then there's a guy who I think is 25 who was supplying him with images and just sending him these photos. And at one point, Huw Edwards says, don't send me anything illegal, I believe he said. But at the same time, it was hundreds of photos, many of which were underage, as young as 7 years old. So obviously he knew what was going on. So I wonder to what extent this is somebody, he must have known this is going to get out. He can't trust this 25-year-old weirdo who's sending him horrible images.
Well, that's a very, very good question. Again, we're trying to understand behavior that seems to be self-destructive or counterproductive, which is at the heart of what, to some extent, psychiatry is.
Risk-taking.
We have to think about what it is that leads people to self-destruction. So going back to the images, the second part of the Huw Edwards case is a second thing that happened. The first part of the case had been dropped because the police said there was no criminal activity, the boy was 17, etc., etc. Then the second thing that happened, and I think it was the police force in Wales had was dealing with someone who they discovered had sent images to Huw Edwards, and that's how he got uncovered. And there were 41 images, and 7 of which are called Category A, which is the most serious element. So you're asking a good question, which is how come people are blind to the risks? And there's several possible answers. Going back to the fact that sex in particular has a very strong compulsive drive to it. So there's a force behind it. When people are compelled or suffering from a compulsion, they will tend to move into the territory of taking more and more risks. And the more risks they take and then they get away with it, they begin not to see the escalation of risk, so that inevitably in the end they take too many risks and they get uncovered. So there's the compulsive push into the territory of risk that may partly explain it. The second thing, of course, with famous people is they're insulated by agents and lawyers, and they've usually often been bailed out by their fame, people turning a blind eye, being lauded, overly praised, love-bombed, if you could say, by the management. So they don't see the management as a threat. And the final point, and this certainly happened with Jimmy Savile, is a view that who's going to believe them? I am who I am, and everyone loves me. Who's going to believe them if they hear something a bit dodgy? Usually they'll think, oh, is it really possible that this wonderful person who raised all this money for charity, in the case of Jimmy Savile, is this vile criminal? Or is the person making the allegation possibly got a screw loose, etc., etc.? So I think that feeds into the narcissism again, that people will think I'm wonderful and find it very difficult to believe these things. Right. So there's all sorts of reasons why people engage in risk, and as they get away with it, take more and more risks.
Interesting. And then what would you, as a celebrity psychiatrist, as in psychiatrist to the celebrities, not a famous psychiatrist yourself, no, you're both a celebrity psychiatrist, what would you, if Huw Edwards called you now, I gather is he in prison already? I don't know.
No, he's not in prison.
So he's just in his house.
Yeah. Well, I think he's broken up from his wife. The newspaper accounts are that he's separated from his wife and he's living in a flat separately. I think that's what the newspaper accounts are at the moment.
Would it happen that he would be calling someone like you, come over, please? And then how do you even begin picking up the pieces? What do you do? Or do you even feel like, I don't want to help you, mate, given what you've been up to?
Well, I have dealt with people who have been in a media spotlight and a media frenzy, but the people I've dealt with have not committed a criminal act. And I think there is a sense in which that would be difficult. However, often it would be the case that with someone like this person we're discussing, because there was one of the reasons the BBC said they dealt with the case they did was I think they had legal letters indicating the person was suffering from a mental illness, and that became part of the reason why they dealt with it a certain way. So obviously at that time they must have been had a professional wrote a letter of some description, one has to surmise. But you're asking a very good question, which is how do people deal with extreme adversity? And in this case, loss of the thing that made your life meaningful, which is you were very famous. Now there's an inversion. You're notorious. You're infamous. And I think that is a very difficult thing to cope with. But I think it is possible to cope with extreme losses. I've dealt with people who've dealt with the loss of vast fortunes. They were worth 500 million and then something happened and now they're worth nothing, and so on and so forth. But loss, coping with loss is part of what psychiatry helps people with. They have to ultimately be able, cut a very long story, I'm cutting to the chase. There are lots of other steps along the way, but finally they've got to be able to replace the thing that made life meaningful with something else. You and I were bantering a bit about tennis, right?
Off air before, yeah.
But if you have to give up millions of pounds and a career, you might get obsessed with tennis, etc., etc. You've got to replace something and replace it with something else.
Yeah, with him it's going to be prison, though, isn't it? That's what he's going to replace his career with.
Not necessarily. We don't know. We don't know.
He's pleaded guilty, hasn't he, to having those images?
Yeah, okay. But the person, for example, who sent the images has received a suspended sentence.
Oh.
I think, according to the press.
I don't know if we come down hard enough on the. I mean, especially a guy sending those images.
Yeah, but you see my point. If the person who sent the
Yeah,
images
yeah.
got a suspended sentence, I'm not entirely convinced
No.
the person who received them is
That's
going to get.
why I say we don't come down hard enough.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not. You know,
legally.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, my point is, it's possible. But you know, even it is. I mean, it is possible to survive extreme adversity. The way that you're raising the question, with a slight, which is understandable, slight note of incredulity, you think there's some things that are impossible to survive, and I don't agree with that. I think it's possible to survive anything and everything. However, you do have to want to survive, and you have to have a reason to survive. If you've lost your wife, which is what may have happened in this case, and maybe your family, maybe you begin to run out of reasons. But generally speaking, you need a reason to survive, and if you have a reason, then you can survive with the right help in terms of developing coping skills.
I think people would not be surprised if he were to take his own life now.
Yes, I do think there's a very serious risk of that. I just want to go back to the point about replacing something with something else. A famous example that was in the news a long time ago that people may have forgotten is Profumo. The Profumo case was someone who lost his job as a minister back in the early 60s, the Christine Keeler scandal. He lost his job and devoted himself to just charity work in the East End. So you can devote yourself to other causes and other things that can begin to make life meaningful. That's always possible. There are many famous cases. Jonathan Aitken, I think, a disgraced former Conservative MP, devoted himself to becoming a religious person, and I think he became a formal priest in some sense. You see what I mean? So you can transform your life.
As a society in general, I feel like we are, when we know we've pushed someone too far within the media, there were a couple of celebrities, for example, who were accused of a few things that were relatively minor and took their own lives. And then we sort of go, oh gosh, what have we done? And we feel terrible. But I wonder if it's a push too far when it involves children and looking at those kinds of photos, if society would collectively go, oh no, that's terrible, he took his life. Or if a lot of people would just go, well, there you go.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think children and sex crimes are some of the things that people find most difficult to deal with and most difficult to see any redeeming possibility. So I agree with that point. I do have to say that we live in a society, I'm not referring to Huw Edwards in this case, where there's a kind of witch hunt thing where people do something bad and everyone piles in, and it doesn't seem like there's any gradation of badness.
No.
Once you've done something bad, then you're just like totally evil. Whereas, you know, there's surely a gradation of people who do things that are quite bad, but not as terrible as sex crimes with children, for example. But we don't live in a society where there's anything that seems to any gradation. You're either evil or you're virtuous. And that in itself, by the way, is dangerous. Jimmy Savile was seen as virtuous. That's a key point I want to make, that over and over again, you see evil lurking beneath situations that people thought were virtuous. So one of the reasons why you see, if I can call it evil, in the BBC is because the BBC is a trusted organisation that people see as virtuous. And over again, the famous example is the Catholic Church, massive scandal to do with Catholic priests. Before that scandal broke, everyone saw the Catholic Church as like irredeemable, so virtuous it just wasn't possible. So over and over again, you see lurking beneath the surface of virtuous organizations, evil, because evil finds a place to hide there because no one thinks of it as possible. Until relatively recently, the last 30 or 40 years, where we discovered the police can be corrupt, the police were seen, around the world as ultimately virtuous. Now we realize actually, some quite dangerous people can lurk within the police force. So we need to be a bit more skeptical always of the apparent virtuousness of certain things. Going back to the NHS, a famous Conservative minister said the NHS, National Health Service in the UK, is the closest the British come to a secular religion. Again, precisely because it's seen as almost entirely virtuous, it will cover up a lot of really terrible things as a result. Will be happening.
Hiding behind a veneer of virtuousness.
Yes.
What about, getting into celebrities and the vanity and the fame and the pursuit of power, an inordinate number of celebrities have started to have children who are apparently trans. What is going on in either the mind of the celebrity themselves or the child?
Well, that's a very, very difficult question. It's very complicated and difficult.
I told you I'd get you in trouble.
Yeah, difficult to answer that one. I think that children of celebrities, in my experience, have quite a difficult time because it's difficult to live up to the attention and the accolades that a famous parent. So I think children of celebrities have quite a difficult time in terms of trying to carve out some kind of meaning in their lives. And I think famous parents don't help because famous parents are still invested in the idea of being famous. And so they find it very difficult to counsel their children that there's more to life than being famous. So I think there's a lot of problems that I've seen in that situation. Now, the trans thing is very controversial as to why people obviously the trans movement has its own version of events about why people come out as being trans. I think it is fair to say that even the trans movement would accept that some people make a mistake. They believe they're born into the wrong gender, but they haven't got that right. And it can be as extreme as them having the surgical procedure, then wanting it reversed afterwards. So given that even the trans movement, I believe, would accept that some errors occur, we want to help people not make those errors and to be able to be really clear. And I believe that simply saying that I feel I was born into the wrong body isn't good enough. I think that the test used to be, and it's a controversial test, you had to live as a different sex for at least a year before people would consider surgery. So I just think that people have to think about the test of a belief as being a bit stronger than simply what people feel. And I believe, and I'm going to get into big trouble now for saying this. Thanks for getting me into trouble.
You won't though, because I'm in an audience bubble, so everyone's just going to love you.
So I think very manipulative. I think very high Mac. Very high Mac. Very high Mac. I think that the problem is that we have to move beyond just emotion and how people feel to a tougher test of what's true in terms of what gender am I really. And I think that people who lead their lives, as many artists do, musicians, famous people, on an emotional roller coaster. That's how pop stars, they're living a very emotional life because they use that to write pop songs and stuff. I think those children will find it difficult in that environment to stick just to move away from the notion that we shouldn't just use our emotions as a guide to action. And that's a very controversial statement. But I think a lot of people get into trouble because they just feel a certain way and they use that as a guide to what they should do. I think we have to move beyond how we feel to other stuff as a guide to action.
It's quite insulting to people like you. You've invested an entire life into these learnings, and that somebody can come and tell you, I feel this way, and you're supposed to go, well, let's not look any deeper then, let's chop that off. I mean,
I agree, but that's the kind of society we live in now.
I mean, is it fair to equate this to an anorexic person who comes in and says, gosh, I'm fat, and you have to go, okay, let's sit that, have a seat. You know, is it similar that we can't just listen to what people say about themselves?
That's a really interesting analogy and a very insightful one, by the way. I'm sure you've had more contact with psychiatry than you're letting on.
Hi, Mac here, complimenting me.
No, but seriously, that's a very, very interesting analogy. So I've dealt with a lot of eating disorders. I worked on the National Referral Center for Eating Disorders for many years. So anorexics are absolutely convinced that they're overweight, even though obviously they're not. And they lose weight and they lose weight because they keep saying, I'm overweight. And you keep saying, what's the evidence that you're overweight? Where are you getting the idea? And they come up with totally unrealistic target weights. As their weight drops and drops and drops, and you do blood tests that show their hemoglobin is dropping and all the biochemistry is going haywire, they ignore all that. They keep going, no, I'm overweight. And then they period stop if they're women. Okay, they drop so low in weight, their periods stop, and then they keep dropping and dropping and dropping. Are we meant to, as you say, accept their version of events, which is they are overweight, in which case they will drop dead? There's a very high mortality rate amongst anorexics. It's one of the most dangerous psychiatric conditions. I think there's a 1 in 10 mortality rate if you get a diagnosis of anorexia. Are we, as a society, meant to stand by and let these people kill themselves? Or do we see it as a treatable psychiatric, very unfashionable term, disorder, which with treatment, they can change their minds about it and move on with their lives? Because the other problem is that the preoccupation with being overweight destroys their lives. They can't do anything else other than spend their lives dieting. So that becomes problematic. There is another problematic thing. I mean, I dealt with this in the NHS, that many anorexics can deliver a very low weight and also are very successful. They get PhDs because they're very goal driven. That most of us are trying to lose weight and we're incompetent at it. Anorexics deliver on a difficult goal. So they are often very successful women as well. On one infamous occasion, I was working in the NHS, and there was a very, very thin anorexic who was dangerously ill and needed admitting to hospital. And I'm going to disguise details to protect confidentiality. And she was so thin and so dangerously ill that we were going to use the section of the Mental Health Act to bring her into hospital against her will. So it requires 2 doctors and a social worker to fill out some pink forms. And I was parked outside the house of the anorexic. The appointment had been booked, so people inside the house knew what was happening. So the social worker drove up, got out the car, looked at the house, and turned to me and said, "It's a very big house." What they were saying between the lines is, this is a very middle-class neighborhood we're in. These are very successful people. Can they really be mentally ill? So when she said, "It's a very big house," are you sure we're in the right place? We should be doing this? This other issue at the heart of the problem with mental illness is, just because you are able to get a PhD and be a CEO of a company, if you are really, really thin and are about to drop dead, just because the rest of your life is functioning doesn't mean there couldn't be a dysfunction over here. So I agree it's a very good analogy, because it's a very similar thing to do with body image and conviction. So there's a real question to be asked.
One of the reasons that I started thinking that way was I did a documentary a while ago about exorcism in Argentina. And exorcism is something that I think a lot of us laugh at because, oh, what a silly old-fashioned practice. But I went and hung out with this Argentinian exorcist, and the people who were coming to see him were mostly young women, 15 to 19 years old. They did present with anorexia, bulimia, maybe OCD, depression, the kinds of things that's what we would say in our Western society. And I wondered just if that is an age that is so impressionable, so difficult, particularly for young girls, the way they're looked at and sexualized and everything. And that it's like something's wrong, I need to think what it is. And for them, it's, oh, there's a demon inside me. And here it seems to be some sort of gendered soul. I have a different gender inside me that must be excavated so that everything can be fine. They do with the exorcism. They do seem to get better after it because of placebo and whatever else for at least a small period of time. And that sometimes happens with trans patients. With regards to anorexia, there was a lot of talk. I think it was Helen Joyce, a speaker about trans and things, who was, or maybe it was Kathleen Stock, talking about Japan. I think it was Japan again. Sorry, I'm bad at this, but that after American films began penetrating the Japanese market, discussion of anorexia was being had for the first time, and suddenly we had this huge social contagion. So I suppose what I'm asking is trans just another kind of social contagion?
Well, or another question you'd be asking, is trans aware of the manifestation of people at a very vulnerable age, between the ages of 15 and 25, which is the peak age at which you're going to develop a mental illness, if you're going to get one?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a way that people think about dysfunction or disturbance of mind, that they reach out for a cultural label that's around them? And in this case, it's trans as a convenient way of thinking about, I'm unhappy with my life.
Yeah.
Therefore, is it possible that one of the reasons I'm unhappy is this thing that I've noticed out there in society? In the case of the exorcism, there was some other label that was available to people in that situation, and we should be cautious about the nature of human unhappiness, and that ultimately, if people are unhappy, we should be thinking about, are there other solutions to why they're unhappy? There are lots of people, doctors included, the trans movement, other movements, very keen to slap a label on you and label and categorize your unhappiness and say, aha, this is the reason you're unhappy.
The symptom pool.
Yeah, well, or basically, I mean, all of them are different versions. I know you did work on cults, of a kind of cult, which is, this is the way to look at the world, and this is the answer. And is it the case that the human predicament is a bit messier than that? I had a client only very recently who was telling me about how problems in their life, and then he said something very interesting. He said, I don't know whether this is depression or not. I don't know whether I should use that word. I'm just telling you that these things have happened. I don't know how to label it. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, because most people come in and they want a label. And they're looking for a way of thinking about their experience which falls into a category. This is one of the very first people I've met recently who was saying, I know that people might use this label, but I'm not sure if it's the right label. So I think, going back to this notion of conformity, we discussed this deep drive. People have a deep drive to label their experiences as a way of understanding it. And maybe they should back away from labeling, or the rush to label, and just think a bit harder about what exactly am I experiencing before being driven to a label. And usually there's some business model behind a label. There's someone somewhere getting something out of a label. Of course, many cynics watching your program will think the pharmaceutical companies are loving the label of depression because they make money from
Or
that
trans.
label. Yeah,
And
I knew
particularly in America.
I knew you'd throw that in.
Yeah, well, you've got to be controversial, right? And particularly in America, because I think the surgeons there are paid a lot of money, and that even if they would like to tell themselves, "I'm not doing it for the money," there's an incentive, a subtle incentive they wouldn't notice. Where if I tell this person that yes, I affirm your concerns, let's cut off your bits, they are financially incentivized.
Yeah, that's a very good point. What are the vested interests in the people I'm seeing, the professionals around me? What is driving them? What is their vested interest? To think a bit more carefully. Maybe it's a bad analogy, but I'm going to go with it anyway. There's a famous billionaire, I've forgotten his name, who seems to be dedicating his billions to trying to live forever. And he's gone as far as getting a blood transfusion, I think, from his own son.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's devoted, he's got this incredible regime where he gets up, I think, at 5 a.m. and, does a huge amount of exercise, has a lot of blood tests, has a lot of doctors throwing different interventions at him because he's convinced he can slow down aging and live forever.
Brian Johnson.
Yes. Okay. I have to say, as a doctor, listen, I'm a big fan of medicine and the science of medicine, but I have to say, if you go to a bunch of doctors, I'm a billionaire, help me live forever, guess what's going to happen? They're going to throw a lot of stuff at you, some of which may shorten your lifespan, actually, rather than actually lengthening it. You need to be cautious about saying to people, I have a lot of money, help me achieve this goal, because people will pile in.
For him, though, philosophically, looking at that, there's one option he can take, which is not giving the money and not doing the research and all that. And he definitely dies at the end of that.
Yes.
So the other option might have those drawbacks you mentioned, which is that doctors selfishly will just give you whatever.
Yeah.
But there's a 0.00001% chance that they will enable him to at least expand his life.
That's a very good counter argument. I like the counter bunch. I'm going to come back at you and say, I'll tell you what I think. You get too many doctors involved, you will shorten your lifespan. They will shorten your life by throwing too many things at you.
Well, how old is he now? Because we might be able to have this conversation in 10 years to see if he's still
I'm
about.
willing to lay a side bet. Poor chap. I'm not hoping this will happen. That he will end up living a less long life. His statistical life expectation should be about 83, 84, at least. And I'm willing to lay money. He will be discovering that he's dead long before that because sensible doctors avoid medical intervention if at all possible.
He's 46, and I've got to say he in some ways looks weird, but I'm not entirely sure that he looks younger than his age. So I don't know that. I think he would say he looks, everyone, a bit like Ricky Gervais in The Office or whatever. Like, how old do you think I am? People say I'm, there's someone says 40. So what do you mean 40? 39, right? I think people will say he looks about 46, to be honest. So he's put a lot of money into this, but who knows?
Yeah, but if he really is getting a blood transfusion, for example, from his son, I mean, that's what I read. That's a blood transfusion is not an innocuous intervention. It can be quite dangerous. So I'm just saying, be careful about asking doctors and giving them a blank check. They will do stuff that may not be in your best interest. The most famous example, of course, in recent times is Michael Jackson's doctor, who I think is in prison, was being paid $100,000 a month and was giving him unending supplies of fentanyl.
That's actually a great example.
And here's the thing, I've seen this in doctors in Harley Street. I've seen doctors who've done the wrong thing with celebrities. They always say to me, their self-rationalization or justification is they're doctor shopping. They'll find another doctor who'll give it to them anyway. Better that I do it because I can maintain some kind of control.
I can earn money as well. How much? What's your cost? What would you what's your number? Like, let's say Michael Jackson approached you, wants you to make his face whiter and his nose thinner and his age younger, and he's offering $1 million a month.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the thing is, that you're asking a very good question. It comes back to fundamentally why you're practicing medicine. If you're practicing medicine to have a bunch of Ferraris in the garage, then you will say yes to that offer. If you're practicing medicine, I know you're going to think this is violin time because you want to help people, then you will say no to that sort of thing. And here's the thing that people don't realize, that often the doctor who says no, I have a lot of patients who ask me for drugs that are addictive or sleep medicines that start off being innocuous but committed. The doctor who says no, which I do quite a lot of the time, is a doctor's looking after your best interests. The doctor who says yes all the time to whatever you're asking for is not usually the doctor's looking after your best interests.
Which takes us back to trans. What about from the perspective of the adult celebrities? Is there some... I'm thinking of 15 years earlier, a lot of them, Angelina Jolie, Madonna, were adopting children. That seemed to be a fashion. And now the fashion, Sting, Cynthia Nixon, David Tennant, a lot of these, they've got trans kids? Is this just another iteration of what was going on with the adoption stuff?
Well, I'm going to say something that's going to make me very unpopular with my celebrity clients and celebrities in general. I mean, being a celebrity requires a huge amount of work because usually you're successful because of your career. It's a very competitive career. You devote yourself, 24/7 to your career as an actor. People come with blockbuster film proposals. You don't say no because you're looking after your career. You can't be a great athlete, win the gold medal 100 meters in the Olympics, win the gold medal in tennis, or be a world famous Oscar-winning actor and a great dad as well. I'm sorry, or a great husband. You can't do it. You have to go one way or the other. So people will marry you because of who you are, but you're very unlikely to be a loving and caring husband because you can't divide your attention up with all those different things. You're not necessarily a terrible human being, but your focus has to be somewhere. You can't be focused on your children and an A-list Oscar-winning actor. Because if you were really focused on your children and the children fall ill or get ADHD or something, you have to ring up Martin Scorsese and say, I can't come into work today. My kid's not well. That's not an acceptable answer in Hollywood. Okay, so you can't have it both ways. I'm saying something really slightly dark, but my experience of ultra successful people is, they're great at winning the 100 meters in the Olympics, but they're not going to be a great dad and a great husband at the same time. Very difficult. And I don't think that's a terrible thing to say. I just think it's part of the deal. And most people around them understand that deal.
I think so. And then so would that mean they might be being a bit selfish with regards to, because I think some of them have been pushing the kids into this.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. I think that having children to a celebrity is not quite the same project as it is to other people who are focused on being a parent. There's something else going on. And what
is that?
Well, they're not focused on looking after children. So it's almost like they're going through the motions of, I'm a human being. Human beings get married. They have children. Yeah, but you can't do that properly and pay attention to your children and be thinking about what your children really need. And so that's why often these celebrities have lots of children, not realizing that actually the more children you have, less attention per child, the more likely there's going to be trouble. They're having a lot of children because they have the money. That means they can do it and they can afford the childcare. And they're not realizing it's not quite the same project as being a hands-on parent.
But what pushes them to push their kids to turn trans? Is it to show them off at Oscar parties?
I don't know the definitive answer to that, but I think it's part of the same thing that we seem to see that a lot of celebrities give very strange names to their children. That was the vogue before the whole trans thing began. I can't remember, is it Frank Zappa who called one of his children Moon Unit or something like that? But anyway, there are lots of, and so that is something about attention and uniqueness. There's something about celebrities that they get addicted to being a bit different, to getting attention and being unique, and therefore they give their kids strange names because they think that's part of what the answer to life, the universe, and everything is. It is not. It's very unwise to give your children a strange name. They're going to be a target for bullying throughout childhood. So give them a relatively straightforward, ordinary name. It's fine.
It's a bit of a vicarious uniqueness that the celebrities are grabbing through their children, like an extension of their own uniqueness that is already been important to them through the children.
And the other thing that happens with celebrities is, unlike you and I, who are surrounded by wives and people who will say, no, that's a really bad idea, Raj. Don't do that. These people are surrounded by yes people who, when they go, I'm thinking of naming my child Moon Unit. What do you think? They'll go, amazing.
Wonderful idea. Bloody
You're
hell.
A genius.
I've got
we need people to say no to us. It's very helpful in life.
No, we don't. I've got one more question, but first, where can people go and follow you and check out your work, go and see you in Harley Street? Where can people go?
Well, they can find me on our website if they want to come and consult with me. I've written several books if people want to have a look at them. I've written a book about resilience, which is what I'm very interested in. In other words, how to cope with great stress, called Staying Sane, and that's available on Amazon. And I've written a book about the psychology of seduction, because I believe a lot of human unhappiness arises out of difficulty in relationships. Not to go off on a side tangent, but I believe that dating apps and the modern way in which people connect with each other has killed a very important idea, which is how we seduce each other or how we look after each other. I think people have lost that art or even an understanding of what that involves. So I've written several books about various aspects. The last book I wrote was about coping with COVID, which may seem a bit unfashionable now, but all the coping skills required to deal with the whole COVID thing that happened in lockdown are still part of what's required to deal with life in general. So I think it's relevant for that. And I have an app where people can listen to my own podcasts, which are much more boring compared to yours. I just interview dry academics, but hopefully it's a lively conversation about some of the things we've been talking about, like personal change
Really
and
interesting.
resilience.
Who's a heretic you admire?
So I like to play a game where when I meet Italians, because the heretic I admire is an Italian, I say to them, who is the most important Italian in history? And they go, what do you mean by important? I go, well, who's had the most impact on the world? Who's changed the world the most? So I like to play this game because they're never going to get it. And there's a reason they're not going to get it. They come out with names like Leonardo da Vinci. And I say that Leonardo da Vinci is an intellectual pygmy in comparison to who I'm thinking of. They go Galileo. They go Michelangelo. Some of them even go Berlusconi or Mussolini. And
I thought you were going to say Mussolini. I thought, here we go. We're going to have to cancel this bit.
And I go, no. Those are all wastrels compared to who I'm thinking of. And of course, I'm referring to the Florentine prince we've already mentioned, Niccolo Machiavelli. And the reason Italians always go, Niccolo. Yeah, of course. Why didn't I think of that? And the reason you didn't think of it was Niccolo Machiavelli is referred to as the first modern man. What is meant by that, he's the first person that publicly rejects the idea that we should use religion as a guide to how to lead our lives. Machiavelli gives a one-line summary. And by the way, this is why the Catholic Church rejects him. He's suppressed by the Catholic Church. Italy is a Catholic country. Therefore, they don't teach Machiavelli that much in school. So Italians haven't heard of him. So I'm making a point by picking this heretic when I discuss with Italians. And Machiavelli wrote this book, The Prince. The Prince is a book on the bedside table of all political leaders or anyone who's ambitious for power. So that's why I'm arguing Machiavelli changed the world more than any other person. So Machiavelli says, let me give you a one-line summary of the Bible. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He says, the Bible says, do the right thing, do good, be moral, and God will make sure it's all fine in the end. You'll get to heaven, and it'll all be okay. And Machiavelli's response to this one-line summary of the Bible is, have you been smoking crack? If you do the right thing, do good, the world will crush you. So what you've got to do is understand what's really going on in the world, which is power is being exercised. It's being exercised against you, and you need to defend yourself. And therefore, you have to adopt the Machiavellian approach to life, which is understand the power dynamic, what's really going on in terms of power around me. And you have to be adopting a manipulative counterattack to defend yourself against this situation. Now, it's very controversial as to whether Machiavelli is saying adopt this philosophy of life all the time, even with your wife or your children. I believe and obviously I'm slightly biased because I'm a fan of the guy, what Machiavelli is saying is when your back is to the wall and you've got no other option, you've got to turn to Machiavellianism as a response to defend yourself against difficulty. But generally speaking, in intimate, close relationships, do not adopt the Machiavellian philosophy. People see people as an ends in themselves and be nice and charming to people. And it's not always about power. But some people would say I'm being naive about Machiavelli. But Machiavelli, to me, is my favorite heretic. He sees the world in a way that's very uncomfortable for us to see it as it is, which is there's always a power dynamic somewhere. Think about that power dynamic and think about whose interests are being served. Famous example, when John F. Kennedy gets assassinated, who benefits from the assassination? Hence all the conspiracy theories that the deputy President LBJ, who takes power, may have been involved. Now, I'm not necessarily a subscriber to that, but I do agree that we should always be thinking about whose interests are being served by anything we read or see. What are people trying to get us to believe? What are they therefore trying to manipulate us into believing? And Machiavelli is saying, let's be skeptical about what's going on around us, because what's going on around us is ultimately the exercise of power.
Bloody hell. That's a scary note to end on. People, please do go follow Dr. Raj Persaud. We're going to put all of his stuff in the links, get his book. He's given up his time. He's been absolutely wonderful. So please do that. Hit that like. I've also got another question for Dr. Raj Persaud on Substack. So go to andrewgoldheretics.com. I'll see you over there. It's a really, really good, juicy question.